Our second speaker, and as a housekeeping note, please be closer as a speaker to the screen, because we have additional part of the stage for panel discussion later. So this is stable one, it's closer to. We want you be safe, okay? Our second speaker, Uильям Хатчинс Зейц.
A pleasure to be here. I guess I'll also be testing my Russian with this presentation. So I'd like to talk a little bit about poverty and poverty measurement and how it works now in Kazakhstan. Maybe talk a little bit about some improvements that could be made or opportunities that there are for deepening the analysis that's done. But also to talk about new and innovative ways of using data to understand poverty, what it correlates with, what the drivers are, and sort of where it's occurring most, and ultimately how it can be used to make more effective policies. So I think most of the people here know about the SDGs. And the first SDG goal is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on one type of poverty measurement called monetary poverty measurement. But as you can tell from the way that the goal is expressed, there are different types of poverty and different policies that are appropriate for different types of challenges. And so, in the World Bank, we often focus a lot on monetary poverty, which, as I said, I'm going to talk a lot about. But there are other issues, multidimensional measures of poverty, which also look at other types of deprivations, which can be particularly important for children. So while I'm not going to talk too much about it right now, I think it's another area that deserves as much attention as the monetary aspects of poverty. So next slide, please. So there are two ways generally that poverty is measured in Kazakhstan, as is the case in most countries. There's what's called the national definition of poverty. That countries will always define in their own terms, depending on what they think is the most appropriate way of doing so. And in Kazakhstan, this is done through income, looking at a minimum amount of income that's necessary for a household, and that threshold is set by the government. There's a separate set of indicators which is maintained mostly by the World Bank, but also other partners, that are internationally comparable. And there's some conceptual differences, but the idea here is pretty similar. What we're trying to see is a threshold under which people don't have enough to make ends meet. And in its extreme form would mean that people can't buy enough food, can't live a healthy and fulfilled life with the budget that they have available in their household. And so these international indicators are the ones I'm going to focus on a little bit more. There's three of these, depending on the income of the country. So the first one, the international poverty line, which receives a lot of attention, is at $1.9 per day in 2011 PPP. And the PPP thing we don't need to get too much into, but the idea here is just to make the indicators comparable across countries. So we want to make sure that the value of the line in Kazakhstan is similar to the value of the line in say, in Argentina, so that we can understand sort of where relative deprivations are greater. But in both of those cases that I gave, both Kazakhstan and Argentina, the share of people living below this line is almost immeasurable in traditional surveys. There are very, very few people in Kazakhstan who live below the $1.90 per day line. That's because Kazakhstan is an upper middle income country in the classifications that we normally use, and so the appropriate line would be $5.5 a day per person, this third one. And so that's where I'm going to focus my attention in the following slides. So why are we particularly interested in child poverty in comparison to poverty overall? Poverty is an important issue, regardless of who it occurs, who who is in poverty, but there are particular vulnerable groups, and children are a prime example, where poverty can be a more serious problem. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but we can think of some crucial ones. One of the first is that there's a window of development when children are very young, that when they don't receive the basic needs, when they don't receive their basic needs, the impact lasts the rest of their life. And so if we don't get it right at the beginning, this poverty, the experience of poverty at a very young age can have repercussions that are very difficult to change and end up being a very difficult thing to escape later in life. And often very expensive to try to ameliorate later in life. The second thing is that, adults that are in poverty can sometimes change their behavior. In some cases, somebody who's in poverty can find a job, or they can move, or there are things that they can do. Now, nobody is saying that that's ever an easy process, but an adult has agency to change the experiences that they have. At least they have more agency than children do. If a child is in poverty, they often have no ability to change the situation that they find themselves in. And so it can be a more persistent state for them. And so talking about children in poverty can be, is a particularly important or particularly salient issue for public policy, because these are people who have a very difficult time, if at all, they're able to respond to the situation that they find themselves in. And so children who are in poverty are of a particular interest for policymakers, above and beyond issues relating to poverty rates overall. Next, please. Don't remember what this slide says. So what data do we need? There are the traditional way of monitoring poverty in a country is to use a survey. Using that survey, you would collect information on income or on consumption, and you would then set a threshold for when people are below the minimum, and that you can represent that as an index to describe sort of who is poor and who's not poor. So this is the traditional way, and Kazakhstan has a world-class data system to enable this type of monitoring. So Kazakhstan has the Household Budget Survey, which is a very large and comprehensive survey that does a very good job of monitoring these sort of traditional measures. You can go beyond sort of the traditional monitoring, which is one of the things that the SDGs are trying to encourage, to disaggregate these type of indicators by vulnerable groups or by individuals in the household. So to look at children as well, to look at old age groups and so on. And so looking at, going the next step beyond sort of the traditional monitoring is an area that hopefully, we will see more of in the region and in Kazakhstan as well. There are also sort of other and more ambitious ways of looking at poverty and understanding poverty using new data and using innovative techniques that can lead to additional information that's needed for developing more targeted policies that address the root causes of poverty in ways that we might not have been able to do using only the traditional methods that we've had in the past. Next slide, please. So here are some statistics. We just updated these recently. So on this side, you have the international poverty measures for Kazakhstan. As you can see, as many of you are probably aware, the historic decline in poverty in Kazakhstan over the past decade or more. Poverty was very common, after independence, but since that time, it's declined precipitously. And by the international definition of poverty, the 1.9, there's almost no poverty measured in the traditional surveys. There's almost nobody who is poor by that definition. Likewise, the 3.2, the lower middle income country poverty line, it's a very, very small share that you might statistically not be able to distinguish from zero. Now, from the 5.5 line, we can see that poverty, again, has declined very quickly over the years. But there's been this, there was this jump a little bit here in 2016, and we can see that there was another jump in other definitions of poverty, including the 5.5 line in 2005. And this leads to, this is related to the situation that Kazakhstan finds itself in economically. So Kazakhstan has a lot of the economy in the oil sector and is very sensitive to oil prices. And when the economic growth has stalled because of changes in the international markets, the poverty rate has increased. And this sort of suggests some policies already, that we want to organize public policy around this idea, not only of poverty reduction, which we've seen Kazakhstan has been very successful at, but also resilience for not falling into poverty when the situation gets more difficult and when the economy stops growing as quickly as it does when the oil prices are higher. And so, there are some policies that the government has put forward around this, and the World Bank also talks about this a lot in terms of creating a robust middle class and encouraging resilience. And that's often, the way that the World Bank would define this is the lack of risk or the minimization of risk of falling into poverty in the first place, which, given the trajectory that Kazakhstan is now on with such low poverty rates and declining poverty rates in every part of the country, in every region, this is sort of the next goal, is a strong middle class that doesn't run the risk of falling into poverty when hardship occurs. Next slide, please. There's a number of choices that one has to make when you're trying to think of poverty at the individual level. And the reason for this is most of the time when we collect information about poverty, we're looking at households. Or we're looking at a family maybe. And so if you can imagine, an average or a representative household has 1 or 2 income earners, and some children. The children don't earn income, and except in very rare cases. And so the measure that we have of household of poverty, or whether people in that household are poor, is a household indicator. There's a household income, or there's a total amount of household consumption. So how do we then disaggregate that for the number of people in the household, or the type of people who are in the household? So this is I think, an unsolved problem. There's a lot of discussion as to how to do this. What the World Bank usually does is to assume that everybody in the household deserves an equal share of the budget. So if the whole budget is 1, then every person in that household will be the same share of that total budget. There are other sort of approaches to this. The reason the World Bank does it this way is that it's relatively conservative. It would assume that children need as much financing or as many resources as anybody else. But there are some sort of choices that could be used with adult equivalence, for instance, is a very common approach, where you would give a smaller share of the budget to children, or you would assume that children require a smaller share of the budget, and with the understanding that they might eat less food, or they might have fewer expenditures and so on. But as I said, the World Bank tends to be conservative on this. As a new parent myself, I can attest that there are a lot of expenses that come with children, and it might not always be the right choice to assume that children are deserve less of the budget than adults do. Next slide, please. So what we can see here in Kazakhstan is that although the rates of poverty are relatively low compared to others in the region, the poverty rate is much higher among children than it is among other groups. And so children are at much higher risk of poverty. And this increases substantially when we look at households that have fewer adult members and more children. So fewer working age adults also means that the poverty rate of those households is higher. So the more children that there are in the household, the higher the rate of the higher the poverty rate, and so there are more children who end up being poor. And households that have any child or additional children are also poorer. Next slide, please. And you can see this as well, you know, when you look at sort of who, at the individual level, you know, the age of people who are poor, you know, the majority of them are children, and it decreases, the risk of poverty decreases linearly as you get older in Kazakhstan. This is the case in many countries, by the way. I mean, almost, I would say most countries, but it's a remarkable tendency. Now, again, the risk of poverty has declined dramatically, but among those who are poor, children are at much higher risk in Kazakhstan still. The presence of a single child in the household almost doubles the risk of poverty, or more. Next slide, please. And this is, I think, reiterating that the younger that children are, the more risk there is for poverty as well, oftentimes because of changes in the way that households organize their work and their income. So, you know, there are fewer opportunities available for earning income among people who stay at home with children, and so during this period of time, the risk of poverty for households is higher. And this is an area where I think both UNICEF and the World Bank have, you know, a lot of work suggesting sort of policies that could ease this transition when there are young children present in the household. Next slide, please. So, I'm trying to remember, sorry, what this slide was. So it's, I think, this is food consumption, sorry. So the other thing that you know, comes out of analysis of the sort of the traditional sources of data in Kazakhstan is that households that struggle with poverty tend to save on the amount of food that they consume. So they'll reduce the amount of food that they consume, and reducing that can lead to sort of fewer calories per person in the household. And because there are more children in such households, this would mean that those households that have more children tend to consume fewer calories per person. And yeah, so I think that's clear. There are particular regions that have more risk of that in Kazakhstan than in others. So here I wanted to talk about some sort of going beyond the traditional monitoring. So the traditional monitoring is getting household poverty. The next steps of deepening that would be to disaggregate by individuals and looking at specific vulnerable groups. And then the next step beyond that is to use innovative techniques to get it even more, to get an even richer sense of what is driving poverty and how to address it. And so some examples I think were brought up earlier about linking studies. Linking studies, you know, can help use sometimes survey data, but can also use administrative data to look in more depth at what is associated with people falling into poverty and can help define policies that reduce that risk. There are other examples of collecting data that you know, is different in design than the sort of traditional survey approaches that we've discussed so far, like the household budget survey in Kazakhstan. And some examples from the region include listening to the citizens of Uzbekistan and listening to Tajikistan, which is a partnership that the World Bank and UNICEF have in those countries. And these surveys look at the situation of a household over a relatively short period of time. So you have information about what households look like, but then every month you follow up and you find out more detail about what's going on in those households and what sort of issues have arisen since the last time that you spoke with them. And this can help a lot for things that tend to fluctuate. You know, when we look at a region like Kazakhstan or in Tajikistan certainly, and in Uzbekistan as well, we know that, you know, seasonality is a very big issue here. You know, it gets very cold in the winter, it gets very hot in the summer, there's a lot of agricultural income, there's a lot of migration seasonally, and so well-being changes, fluctuates during the year, and so there might be different policies that are appropriate at different points. And having these sort of high-frequency data help to identify those trends and to develop policy responses. So next slide, please. So here is a way of doing that we've tried in Tajikistan. And so what we've done here is we've taken characteristics of the households that we know from the first time we've spoken with them about sort of whether they have access to clean water, whether they have access to a stable electricity supply, these sorts of things. And then what we do is we monitor the changes in different measures of well-being over time in an index. And so, when we have a measure like this, what we can see are relatively high frequency trends that tell us how things are evolving within the year and over time between years in a way that's much more granular and much more detailed than a single cross-sectional survey. So what this, some of the power of this sort of analysis is that we can look at, say, a group that's multidimensionally poor, that's how we've defined them here, and we can see whether things are getting better or worse, and we can also break this down into the indicators that create the index to understand what it is that's changing, that's making things get better or worse. And this can be linked directly to policy. So if it's the case that water outages are what's driving a deterioration in well-being, there are clear sort of policies that can come out of that discussion, which has proven to be very useful. So this is sort of a non-traditional or next step sort of monitoring technique that can help to inform policies relating to poverty and deprivation. So next slide, please. Another area that is sort of the next step beyond what is being done currently would be, as an example, would be to take satellite data and to connect it with the information that we have available from surveys to try to get more precise and more disaggregated information using what's called a small area estimation techniques. And so this is an example from the poverty mapping of Kazakhstan. So the survey would never be representative at the level of districts in this way. But if you were to match that information with satellite data on on the conditions of each of these places, you can get much greater precision in the estimates that you get from the survey. And then you can identify with this information leading and lagging regions and areas of particular deprivation that you would never be able to identify from the survey alone. And so here you can do heat mapping to see where there are pockets or particular areas that are abnormal, that are away from what we would anticipate. And this, again, can be linked to regional policies, such as the ones that the government has ongoing to this day. So next slide, please. Just a couple of slides in summary. Kazakhstan has achieved something fantastic in its historic decline in poverty over time. And I think that the stage is set sort of for the next step, which is a society, a middle-class society that has very little risk of people falling into poverty when shocks arrive. And I think the message also is that there are particular groups of people, and particularly children, that are at greater risk. And public policy can be informed by different data approaches to analyzing data in new ways that can inform those policies to make these groups more resilient. And that, as the next step, there are new and innovative techniques to better understand the incidence of poverty and responses to it. So with that, I hope we still have time for some questions. I'm very grateful again to the organizers and for all of you for being here and for allowing me to speak. So
I'm here to help with the questions. Thank you very much, Willem. Please.
Yes, I have a question. So when you collected your data, you probably met some anomalies. Like, did it match with your other data? So what did you do? Like empty spaces, like data that may be missing. Like, what did you do with them?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So there are a suite of techniques to deal with these sorts of problems. And in the case of the data that are being presented here, these are all official statistics that are collected by the National Statistical Agency here in Kazakhstan. And so most of these sort of techniques to deal with missing values and anomalies in the data were taken by the statistical agency. But in most cases, what can be done, and particularly in this example of listening to Tajikistan, I can speak to that quite a bit as well. If you're collecting information that ends up having anomalies, there's no reason that you can't try to follow up with those respondents to see what the anomaly was related to. At the end of the day, these data are from specific people, from specific households, and you can go back and you can find out what it was that didn't work. And so, that's sort of the one way that you can deal with these questions when they arise. But in the case of the household budget survey in Kazakhstan, and in the case of the other data sources that I've presented here, these sort of anomalies are relatively rare and relatively easy to deal with in most cases.
Я не знаю, синяя кофта придает смелости или ума, но давайте, может быть, кто-то не в синей кофте может задать вопрос. Это не... Я вас не дискриминирую, пожалуйста. Если есть у вас вопросы, задавайте. Please, Aaron. И потом к вам. А у вас еще пиджак сверху. No, there is a question.
Thanks for the presentation. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit about what the World Bank is doing to expand its kind of scope on definitions of poverty. So going beyond income poverty, monetary poverty, to multidimensional forms of poverty. I know there's some interesting work happening here. It deepens the complexity of the analysis significantly to look at other forms of deprivations in terms of defining poverty. Maybe you can speak a little bit about where that's at in terms of the World Bank's thinking.
Yeah, I'd be very glad to. So there's, the traditional measures that I described, with, the internationally comparable poverty estimates looking at monetary poverty. But as you suggest, there's an initiative, I think, it's, the discussion includes colleagues from UNICEF, but also other groups to look at indexes that summarize different types of deprivations in a comparable way across countries. This is a really big challenge. In some of the versions that I've heard discussed in the World Bank, there have been several proposals. There's a question of whether one dimension should be a monetary component, or whether a multidimensional poverty index should be an indicator that only summarizes non-monetary measures of poverty. So I think that the discussion is still ongoing about how that will ultimately be defined. But in the interim, I know that there's a method from OFI that that has been adopted in many countries and is used by many UN agencies, and the World Bank also monitors regularly. And so this, I think, is sort of the standard that we're working under until the final components of sort of an international definition of multidimensional poverty can be agreed upon. I think that part of the reason that this is a difficult problem is that when we are making indicators like this, we're trying to make something that can be compared across countries, so that we can see where not just within countries but also across countries there are particular deprivations. But this is a difficult question. So if I think, for instance, if somebody in Astana lacks access to heating, that's a really big problem, right? And it's something that is a very clear deprivation. If somebody lacks access to heating in Malawi, it's less clear, how big of a deprivation that is, or the depth of that deprivation, and then how to summarize that in the terms of how much weight you give to the different indicators is a challenge. And so I think that that we haven't really gotten to a final conclusion about how to deal with those sorts of questions. But that clearly the issue of multidimensional poverty and looking beyond simply looking at sort of a household budget or a household level income is a very important one for the World Bank. I can also say that in many cases we look at subjective poverty indicators as well. These tend to not be as systematized or reported in sort of the same way because, you know, it's a subjective assessment of a person's poverty status, but we still report it in particular country contexts where it seems very informative. So, you know, for instance, in the countries that I've worked in Eastern Europe and in Central Asia, we often report subjective poverty indicators because, you know, these are also very informative, especially when somebody doesn't look monetarily poor, but feels poor, and feels that, you know, maybe public policy isn't oriented enough towards their concerns. This would be a group of people that we want to understand better and to try to assist to the extent possible. And so it's a way of enriching, again, who are at risk or vulnerable for reasons that we don't measure otherwise.
Thank you very much, William.